Hi, I'm Rich Saylor. I'm an archivist at the Pennsylvania State Archives, which is a bureau within the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. I'm here today to speak about Philadelphia's nonviolent resistance to the 1773 British tea tax. Pennsylvania played a leading role in the resistance against the British tea tax of 1773. As the largest city in America, Philadelphia was extremely important and influential throughout the colonies. The Philadelphia Resolutions of 1773, written on October 16th of that year, were the first organized public protest against the new tax. These resolutions enumerated the reasons why Americans should resist this British tax. They specified that it was the duty of every American to oppose the British plan to send duty-imposed tea to the 13 colonies, and called on all those who loved liberty to dissuade their local merchants from acting as British agents and accepting the tea shipments. Rebellious groups in other colonies adopted the resolutions as their raison d'etre for resisting the tea tax, including those in Boston, Massachusetts. The year 1773 was filled with turmoil in the transatlantic world. Great Britain was determined to increase its tax collections in the American colonies due to the cost of the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763, also known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, which devastated its finances. The British attempted to achieve this by restricting trade partners for American colonists and imposing or increasing taxes on goods imported into the colonies. It was well known by the 1760s that smuggling was widespread throughout America, which enabled colonists to reduce the amount of taxes they paid to the British Crown. The American colonists were shocked and upset regarding the new taxes and began to protest what they perceived to be the Crown's egregious policies. Particularly offensive to the Americans were burdensome taxes placed on the importation of tea. For quite some time, colonists had been buying their imported tea on the black market, usually from Holland. Prior to the tea tax, between 1764 and 1773, Great Britain passed a series of acts of parliament that caused widespread concern, protests, and rebellious actions in its American colonies. The Sugar Act of 1764 was the first act that caused colonial outrage. It added a new level of tariffs on colonial trade and attempted to halt the American practice of importing sugar and molasses from the French East Indies. In 1765, the British passed the Stamp Act. Beginning November 1765, all legal documents would be invalid unless the appropriate stamps were purchased from official distributors and adhered to the paper articles. Items such as almanacs, insurance policies, liquor licenses, newspapers, pamphlets, passports, playing cards, and ship's papers had to bear the stamps. It was an unprecedented direct sales tax. The money raised from the tax was supposed to be used only to pay British soldiers and other officials stationed in America. Nevertheless, this new tax created extreme dismay and unrest in the American colonies. It was a burden that would affect the lives of every American, not just rich landowners or merchants. Colonists believed the Stamp Act to be illegal since there were no Americans seated in British Parliament. This act caused the American phrase, "no taxation without representation," to become popularized. Colonial merchants organized to develop plans to economically resist this new British policy. The American response to the Stamp Act helped to meld and unite the separate colonies into a more tightly knit confederation. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766 due to the American colonists' rebellious protests and boycotts against it. Great Britain next imposed a series of measures known as the Townshend Acts on the American colonies in 1767. These new duties or taxes, named after the Act's designer, Britain's Charles Townshend, were placed on all glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea that were imported into the colonies. Colonists saw these new taxes as a clear abuse of power. Mobs of Americans rioted against these new laws. The British sent additional troops to America to try to enforce these new taxes. This action heightened tension between the colonies and the British government, which led to the Boston Massacre of March 5, 1770. This infamous episode in history occurred when a jeering crowd of colonial protesters began throwing snowballs and stones at the British troops guarding the British Customs House in Boston. Despite orders to the contrary, the British troops fired a volley into the crowd, killing 3 people outright and injuring 8 others, 2 of them mortally. This marked the moment that colonial protests against British tax policies became deadly. Boycotts of British goods continued through the early 1770s. Eventually, Parliament revoked the Townshend Acts in 1770, except for leaving a symbolic tax on tea. The most historically notable events of 1773 in America occurred as colonists reacted to Parliament's passage of the Tea Act. But why did the British institute this act at that time? One of the reasons it was introduced by the British was to save the almost bankrupt British East India Company. It barred the colonists from importing tea from any other sources. The Tea Act gave the East India Company a monopoly on the tea trade in America. It reinforced the Crown's resolve to make the Americans pay a tax on tea, which had been around since the Townshend Acts of 1767. The act also allowed the East India Company to sell its tea directly to American colonists, removing any intermediaries, which enabled it to lower its prices and compete more readily with the smuggled Dutch tea that Americans had been purchasing for years in substantial amounts. This rekindled American opposition to any type of tea tax being imposed on them by the British Parliament. Colonists viewed the direct tax as illegal and worried it would lead toward the enslavement of the American colonies, the plundering of their property, and the removal of their liberty. A newspaper article dated October 11, 1773, states that if the British tea shipment lands in America, it is feared that it will find its way amongst us. Then farewell to American liberty. We are undone forever. Furthermore, the colonists detested the East India Company, claiming that once they get footing in this once happy country, they will leave no stone unturned to become your masters. They are well versed in tyranny, plunder, oppression, and bloodshed. What fostered this turmoil that saw numerous port cities in America openly rebel against the new British tea tax? Pennsylvanians were leaders in the resistance to this British tax. The movement in the colonies dates to the passing of the Philadelphia Resolutions of 1773. The resolutions were crafted by prominent Pennsylvanians associated with the Sons of Liberty, an organization established in 1765 to rally colonial resistance. Members of the Philadelphia chapter, including Dr. Benjamin Rush, William Bradford, Dr. William Cadwallader, and Thomas Mifflin, drafted the resolutions at Pennsylvania's State House, now Independence Hall, in Philadelphia. Created on October 16, 1773, the Philadelphia Resolutions were the first public protest of the importation of taxed tea. Published in the Pennsylvania Gazette by Benjamin Franklin, the resolutions declared the following. Number 1, that the disposal of their own property is the inherent right of freemen, that there can be no property in that which another can, of right, take from us without our consent, that the claim of Parliament to tax America is, in other words, a claim of right to levy contributions on us at pleasure. Number 2, that the duty imposed by Parliament upon tea landed in America is a tax on the Americans, or levying contributions on them without their consent. Number 3, that the express purpose for which the tax is levied on the Americans, namely for the support of government, administration of justice, and defense of His Majesty's dominions in America, has a direct tendency to render assemblies useless and to introduce arbitrary government and slavery. Number 4, that a virtuous and steady opposition to this ministerial plan of governing America is absolutely necessary to preserve even the shadow of liberty, and is a duty which every free man in America owes to the country, to himself, and to his posterity. Number 5, that the resolutions lately entered into by the East India Company to send out their tea to America, subject to the payment of duties on it being landed here, is an open attempt to enforce the ministerial plan and a violent attack upon the liberties of America. Number 6, that is the duty of every American to oppose this attempt. Number 7, that whoever shall directly or indirectly countenance this attempt, or in any ways aid or abet in unloading, receiving, or vending the tea sent or to be sent out by the East India Company, while it remains subject to the payment of a duty here, is an enemy to this country. And number 8, that a committee be immediately chosen to wait on those gentlemen who, it is reported, are appointed by the East India Company to receive and sell said tea, and request them, from regard to their own characters and peace and good order of the city and province, immediately to resign their positions. These resolutions clearly set forth the arguments that the tea tax was a direct challenge to the colonists' liberty, and that it was the duty of all Americans to oppose the tax. 3 weeks later, a similar protest group in Boston met at Faneuil Hall and adopted the Philadelphia resolutions verbatim. These resolutions would trigger public protest over the British tea taxation policy and push the colonists further down the road to revolution. Years later, in 1809, Pennsylvania's patriot Dr. Benjamin Rush wrote to then former President John Adams the following letter excerpt. I once heard you say the active business of the American Revolution began in Philadelphia, in the act of her citizens in sending back the tea ship, and that Massachusetts would have received her portion of the tea had not our example encouraged her to expect union and a support in destroying it. The flame kindled on that day soon extended to Boston and gradually spread throughout the whole continent. Following the drafting of these resolutions, colonists in numerous American cities staged what are referred to as tea parties or tea protests, Boston, Charleston, and Philadelphia chiefly among them. In Charleston, on December 3rd, the rebelling colonists refused to pay the duty on a shipment of tea and made the tea-laden ships wait in the harbor for 3 weeks before determining to seize the tea and store it in the city's exchange building, while boycotting it being bought or sold until 1776. While Boston, on December 16th, became historically famous for dumping 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor, the protesters in Philadelphia took a different approach. Tea agents in Charleston, New York, and Philadelphia were forced by their fellow citizens to resign their offices. Referring to the tea agents in Philadelphia on October 18, 1773, a newspaper stated, "It is even reported that some of them were born in this province. Oh, my country, my country! It is high time you should suffer if you have already given birth to monsters." Philadelphia Quaker merchants James and Drinker rescinded their agreement to act as tea agents for the East India Company after suffering duress from their fellow citizens on December 2nd, 1773. In Philadelphia, on December 27th, the angry colonists turned away a British tea-laden ship, refusing to allow it to unload its stores of tea in the city of brotherly love. These tea protests touched off events that would lead to the beginning of the American Revolutionary War at the Battle of Lexington and Concord in 1775. Published threats concerning the tea tax on broadsides and handbills began appearing in port cities on the east coast of America. The Committee of Tarring and Feathering, an organization that promoted vigilante justice as a form of protest against British taxation, published a warning on November 27, 1773, to Delaware river pilots who might encounter the expected British ship Polly on its attempt to land tea at Philadelphia Harbor. To the Delaware pilots, we took the pleasure some days since of kindly admonishing you to do your duty, if perchance you should meet with the tea ship Polly, Captain Ayres, a 3-decker which is hourly expected. We have now to add that matters ripen fast here, and that much is expected from those lads who meet with the tea ship. There is some talk of a handsome reward for the pilot who gives the first good account of her. How that may be, we cannot be for certain. But all agree that tar and feathers will be the portion who pilots her into the harbor, and we will answer for ourselves that whoever is committed to us as an offender against the rights of America will experience the utmost exertion of our abilities as the Committee of Tarring and Feathering. P.S. We expect you will furnish yourself with copies of the foregoing and following letter, which are printed for this purpose, that the pilot who meets with Captain Ayres may favor him with a sight of them, the Committee of Tarring and Feathering. In colonial times, tarring and feathering was usually used as a form of vigilante justice and became a favorite of early American patriots in their protest against British taxation. Tax collectors, customs officials, or avowed loyalists were apprehended by a crowd or mob of colonists to be publicly punished and humiliated. Hot pine tar would be poured over the stripped victim's head and body, followed quickly by dumping feathers on the tar-covered person. Another method was to brush hot tar onto the victim, followed by rolling them in a pile of feathers. The second part to the broadside of November 27, 1773, was a message directed to the captain of the British tea-ship Polly. It was posted around town on broadsides and printed in local newspapers. Delaware River pilots were encouraged to take copies along with them on their boats to share with Captain Ayres if they contacted him. To Captain Ayres, of the ship Polly on a voyage from London to Philadelphia. We are informed that you have imprudently taken charge of a quantity of tea which has been sent out by the India Company under the auspices of the ministry, as a trial of American virtue and resolution. Now, as your cargo on your arrival here will most assuredly bring you into hot water, and as you are perhaps a stranger to these parts, we have concluded to advise you of the present situation of affairs in Philadelphia, that, taking time by the forelock, you may stop short in your dangerous errand. Secure your ship against the rafts of combustible matter which may be set on fire and turned loose against her, and more than all this, that you preserve your own person from the pitch and feathers that are prepared for you. In the first place, we must tell you that Pennsylvanians are, to a man, passionately fond of freedom, the birthright of Americans, and at all events are determined to enjoy it. That they sincerely believe no power on the face of the earth has a right to tax them without their consent. That, in their opinion, the tea in your custody is designed by the ministry to enforce such a tax, which they will undoubtedly oppose, and in so doing, give you every possible obstruction. We are nominated to a very disagreeable but necessary service. To our care are committed all offenders against the rights of America, and hapless is he whose evil destiny has doomed him to suffer at our hands. You are sent out on a diabolical service, and if you are so foolish and obstinate as to complete your voyage by bringing your ship to anchor in this port, you may run such a gauntlet as will induce you, in your last moments, most heartily to curse those who have made you the dupe of their avarice and ambition. What think you, Captain, of a halter around your neck, 10 gallons of liquid tar decanted on your pate, with the feathers of a dozen wild geese laid over that to enliven your appearance? Only think seriously of this, and fly to the place from where you came. Fly without hesitation, without the formality of a protest, and above all, Captain Ayres, let us advise you to fly without the wild geese feathers. Your friends to serve, the committee as before subscribed. Another warning was written on December 7th, 1773, 9 days before the Boston Tea Party, and posted on broadsides around the city of Philadelphia. It was also published in newspapers as an open letter to the British ship's captain of the expected British cargo ship Polly. It was written anonymously, but has since been attributed by historians to Thomas Mifflin, a future governor of Pennsylvania. To the Delaware pilots, the regard we have for your characters and our desire to promote your future peace and safety are the creation of this third address to you. In our second letter, we acquainted you that the tea ship was a 3-decker. We are now informed by good authority she is not a 3-decker, but an old black ship without a head or any ornaments. The captain is a short, fat fellow, and a little obstinate withal. So much the worse for him. For so sure that he rides rusty, we shall heave him keel out. His upper works, too, will have an overhauling. And it is said he has a good deal of quick work about him. We will take particular care that such part of him undergoes a thorough rummaging. We have a still worse account of his owner, for it is said the ship Polly was bought by him on purpose to make a penny of us, and that he and Captain Ayres were well advised of the risk they would run in thus daring to insult and abuse us. Captain Ayres was here in the time of the Stamp Act, and ought to have known our people better than to have expected we would be so mean as to suffer his rotten tea to be funneled down our throats, with the Parliament's duty mixed with it. We know him well and have calculated to a gill and a feather how much it will require to fit him for an American exhibition. And we hope not one of your body will behave so ill as to oblige us to clap him in the cart alongside the captain. We must repeat, the ship Polly is an old black ship of about 250 tons burden, without a head and without ornaments, and that Captain Ayres is a thick, chunky fellow. As such, take care to avoid them. Your old friends, the Committee for Tarring and Feathering. On December 25th, 1773, the British ship Polly arrived laden with 698 chests of tea in the Delaware River at Chester, near Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the largest city in America at that time, and as such, the British tea shipment was twice the size of that sent to Boston. Approximately 6,000 to 8,000 disgruntled Philadelphians met to determine what to do about the ship and its cargo on the morning of December 27th, 1773. At 2 p.m. that day at Gloucester's Point, the British ship's captain, Samuel Ayres, was hailed and told that if he tried to unload his cargo of tea, he would be tarred and feathered. He was requested to come ashore. He complied and was escorted into Philadelphia by a committee of men, where he was warned again about the city residents' decision not to allow the tea to be unloaded in Philadelphia harbor. Philadelphians intimidated Captain Ayres with their openly rebellious stance on the tea shipment, and wisely the British captain heeded their warning. Ayres took on necessary supplies for the Polly and directed his ship to leave the Delaware River and travel back to England on December 28th. So why did the Boston Tea Party include an act of violence while the one in Philadelphia did not? No private property of merchants or tea was destroyed in Pennsylvania during its Tea Party or tea resistance of 1773. Philadelphia had, by that time, a long-standing tradition of nonviolence which was heavily influenced by the Quaker religious belief in pacifism. The Quakers developed a history of nonviolent protest instead of an outward use of weapons to seek peaceful solutions to injustices. The Quakers dominated influence over the Pennsylvania Assembly until 1756. This influence dates to 1681, when Pennsylvania's founder, William Penn, sought a policy of peace and liberty in governing his new colony. It should be remembered, however, that Philadelphians did resort to threats of violence against British-appointed tax collectors and a captain of a cargo ship laden with tea, as exemplified by the warnings issued by the Committee for Tarring and Feathering. Meanwhile, Boston had already experienced a violent event, the Boston Massacre, in which British troops had spilled American blood during the protest in 1770. With the door already open to violent conflict between colonists and the British in Boston, further escalation of tensions there were more greatly inclined to be physical. Furthermore, British treatment of Boston colonists was more severe than that felt by Philadelphians and other colonial cities. This in part stemmed from the severe agitation of Boston protesters who participated in their local Sons of Liberty and led campaigns against direct British taxation, inspiring riots in the streets of Boston, and the destruction of private property belonging to tax collectors and Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts. In response to the tea tax resistance and the protests in Charleston, Boston, and Philadelphia, the British government passed the Coercive or Intolerable Acts of 1774, which punished Massachusetts directly for the destruction of tea in Boston Harbor. Other colonists, including Philadelphians, saw these acts as punishment intended to negatively impact all of the colonies. Instead of strengthening British authority in America, these acts further united the American colonists in their opposition to British rule, which violated their inalienable rights as men and as Christians. All these events led, for many Americans, to further alienation from Great Britain. At the same time, it pulled the colonies closer together. It soon became apparent that reconciliation with the British Crown was no longer a reasonable option for the colonies. Pennsylvania in general, and Philadelphia in particular, continued to play a leading role in resistance to British authority following 1773. From September to October 1774, the First Continental Congress met in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia to discuss mounting British aggression in the form of the Intolerable Acts. The Second Continental Congress also met in Philadelphia at Independence Hall beginning on May 10, 1775, a month after the battles of Lexington and Concord. It functioned as a de facto national government as the colonies moved away from Great Britain politically and militarily. And perhaps most famously, the Declaration of Independence was both written and approved in Philadelphia in 1776. Pennsylvania's role in rebellious actions in the years predating the American Revolutionary War through the writing of the Constitution of the United States in 1787 were unique in their breadth, scope, and importance to the early formation of the nation. Thank you.